Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Gordon Brown became Prime Minister with a promise of change. But how much change has he actually delivered? No change on the war in Iraq, no change on ID cards, no change on the creeping privatisation of health and education, and no change on plans to expand nuclear power generation. We have to ask ourselves, is this Prime Minister really committed to change, or is he just a continuation of Tony Blair by another name? With me to discuss the first few weeks of Gordon Brown's premiership is Chris McLaughlin, the editor of Tribune, Labour's left-wing weekly. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Peter.
I just wanted to start. What's your assessment of Gordon Brown so far? I mean, I know it's early days, but he doesn't seem to have brought about the change that he sort of promised. There's been some tinkering, but no substantive shifts in policy.
Well, I think as you indicated in your introduction, Peter, the jury's still out, and I think we may be out for a very long time. What there definitely has been is a mood change in the Labour Party, a mood change in the government. There is a feeling that there's been a change of government, and that's brought about a very much more optimistic outlook and perspective within the Labour Party itself.
And perhaps the wider society, since he's got this bounce in the polls.
I was just going on to say that at the same time as the two by-elections that we had in Britain last week showed, at the same time as Cameron seems to have shown himself not to have been able to win the public trust, which he's so avidly tried to gain in presenting the Tory party as changed. It looks at the moment as though the electors think the change has happened more in the Labour Party under Gordon Brown than it has in the Tory party under David Cameron.
Do you think this is just a honeymoon period, or do you think it's a substantive shift in public opinion?
I think it could well be a honeymoon period, because the longer that the public get to see and that Gordon Brown may not have really changed, may not have effective change on all those important issues, especially health and education, the more they might be thinking that he was not the new Prime Minister that they think he is now, after all.
Does that mean that he may well go for an early general election while the public confidence or a boost in confidence appears to have taken place?
I'm told fairly reliably that he generally hasn't made up his mind, but my instinct, and it's not countered by any of the people that I've been speaking to, is that he would like to go next spring rather than in 2009.
Not in autumn this year?
Definitely not in autumn this year.
Why not?
Because for the reason that may rule out next spring as well, and that's that the Labour Party is not in a condition to fight a general election. And then if Gordon Brown is going to display his notorious caution in one respect, it's going to be to make sure that the Labour Party is in a condition to fight before he goes. It's got no money, it's still in debt. The Conservative Party has got a big surge in terms of donations and cash ahead of the Labour Party. And it's run out, it's halved its staff. It's got half the staff it had a year ago.
But people might say, well, does it matter? He's got this, bounce in the polls, which is going to, if it was reflected in votes, would see him happily back in office. Even if he lost half of his poll lead, he's still sitting pretty.
I think that's a judgment that we can make, and we might do, but we're not Gordon Brown. And I think in this case, that kind of caution would lead him to hold off. Rather.
So prudence in electoral timing.
Prudence in electoral timing. Certainly not this autumn, I would say. Possibly in the spring, but not definite.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the whole issue of change and what change has been brought about. I mean, I get your sense that you're absolutely right. There is a change of feeling. He has given a new image to Labour, and he has been very effective in that, reflected in the increased ratings for Labour in the polls. But going back to these core fundamental issues, do you think we're likely to see, for example, any movement or shift on the Iraq policy?
Yeah, I do actually. I think I think he will. His main focus over the next 6 to 12 months is going to be to outflank Cameron and to leave him dead in the water as a threat. And while this might seem a rather cynical way to approach the serious situation in Iraq, I think one of the ways he'll do that is by announcing an earlier staged troop withdrawal. And in that respect, I think we'll see a change of policy on Iraq.
When might we see that, do you think?
I think sometime after the public spending announcements that we'll be making in October, and possibly as early as a party conference, which is at the end of September, October.
And do you think this will be like withdrawal over a 18-month period, or will it be total withdrawal or just partial?
I don't know all the details. I'm told that it will be partial, but crucially, he will put in that caveat, as always, that it will be negotiated with the advice of the military commanders. But it will be a symbolic gesture, I think, to say we are trying to change our policy, and we recognise that mistakes have been made in a way that Tony Blair wasn't able to say.
Isn't that likely to provoke some kind of rupture with the US president?
I think he's preparing for some sort of rupture with the US president, but I think in his visit, which will happen in the next week or two to Washington, I think he'll be preparing Washington and the White House for some kind of not eruption. I think he'll be saying, "Look, we both got a problem. We'll go first if you want, but you, President Bush, are going to have to announce a withdrawal as well at some stage. But we're going first." And
so he's prepared to possibly move on a British phased withdrawal independently of the Americans.
I don't think it would be his wish to do that, but I think he's going to make it clear to Bush that we would be prepared to do that. Naturally, he'd want to get some sort of agreement with the Americans, but I think, and it's speculation, but I've not had this denied by Brown's camp, that he will be prepared to go alone on some sort of symbolic gesture of removing the troops on an earlier timetable.
And what about the vexed issue of some replacement security? Because obviously, I was never in favour of the war. I'm against the occupation, but
like
there is a big concern that if the troops come out and there's a vacuum, then the Shia fundamentalist death squads and the insurgents will step into the breach, and there'll be a bloodbath like there was in Iran after the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution.
Yeah.
Particularly of people of the left, they'll be the prime victims. Yeah. So I just wondered, do you get any sense that there may be some commitment to try and involve the United Nations or Arab-sponsored or Muslim-sponsored peacekeeping forces?
Definitely, I think definitely the United Nations, but that will be part of the phasing. That's why it wouldn't be a total withdrawal, which would result in that. I think he wants to involve the United Nations and Muslim nations as well, although that's going to be quite a difficult, but some might say impossible task.
Do you think he might be prepared to put British troops under UN control as the withdrawal gets underway? I
really don't know. I don't know the answer to that question at all. I don't know of any discussions that have taken place on that.
To move the subject a bit onto the issue of the private finance initiative, foundation hospitals, all those kind of issues. I think a lot of people, like myself, who was in the Labour Party for 22 years, have been absolutely aghast at the way in which a Labour government has brought in the creeping privatisation of public services, and in particular the impact it's having on the health service. And lots of trusts are now having to stump up huge bills of 20-30 million pounds to pay off for the private finance initiative. In Oxfordshire, where I'm a Green Party candidate, it's going to mean that the health authorities there are going to be really strapped for cash in the coming year.
Yeah, I think on these points, this is where we'll see a disillusionment setting in on the left and in the millions of people who work for the health service as well. On the health service itself, I think, I'm told that there will be another huge amount of money announced for the NHS in the October spending public spending announcement. But here again, Brown is going to run into trouble with the unions, because he's going to say, we've given you all this money, but the nurses, doctors, the staff will not benefit from it. So we won't see any, I don't think, fundamental change on the issue that you've just outlined, which is where much of the money that has already gone into the health service has simply poured into the pockets of private venture capitalists. And Brown's attitude does seem to be more, somebody told me at the Treasury last night, not a minister obviously, but a journalist for another paper, that the Cameron camp are going around tearing their hair out, saying that this man is more Tory than ever we would have been. Now, it's significant that he's brought in people like Digby Jones from the CBI, Confederation, the British Industry.
A real union basher.
A real union basher. He was against the national minimum wage, still is. Refused to take the Labour whip in Parliament, and in every way unreconstructed. But Brown was...
it's easy to confuse them.
There you go. He was prepared to see Digby Jones in the CBI before for example, he saw the unions. And he set up an advisory panel to help the government on economic strategy, which simply doesn't include any unions. So that sends a message to the party which I think could have greater resonance further down the line. And on ID cards...
just before you go on to that, can I just finish up on this point about the relationship with the unions? I think a lot of trade unions were very shocked that, when he was still Chancellor, he imposed this, was it 2.5% increase, which was effectively below inflation.
Yes.
So, in other words, a de facto pay cut on NHS workers. Yeah. It doesn't send a good signal.
It doesn't, and I think he's going to stick to that. It was that keeping down the pay in the public sector was described to me as one of the tough decisions that he's going to have to make. And when politicians talk about tough decisions, it means they've already made up their mind.
And where is the new money going to go? You said there's going to be a big increase in money for the health service in the autumn, but presumably that's not going to go on wages, it's going to go on...
It's going to go on extending the building programme and the continuation of the A&E departments. Well, there has been a great success. There's, I think, 50% at least of hospitals have got completely new or remodernised A&E departments since 1997. So there has been some success, and I think he wants to extend that, but it won't be going on wages. Partly because the issuing of new contracts for junior doctors has gone completely wrong. Partly because the Treasury believe that general practitioners are now very well paid and don't need to get paid anymore. But that has, if that has a knock-on effect of keeping down the wages of the lower paid staff, the ancillary workers, the nurses, then that's going to be seen as very unfair, and I think there will be a lot of union reaction to that.
I mean, certainly this is the new information coming out about the widening gap between rich and poor in our society is not what you expect under a Labour government, and this isn't, they can't blame it on the Tories. We had a decade of Labour government, where these things could have been rectified, but in fact, things far from the gap narrowing, it's actually widening.
Well, indeed, as the Roundtree report to which you refer found last week, the gap between the wealthy and the poor is greater now than for 30 or 40 years. And that, in a way, is a kind of damning legacy of 10 years of new Labour government, because the policies added up to as a whole in terms of freeing up the market sector and the take that private capital can take out of the system in terms of relaxed tax regimes and the input at the lower end in terms of benefits and social welfare, the policies under New Labour have exacerbated that gap.
I mean, how do you think the trade unions are going to bear up under this? Because they have been under sustained assault, firstly under the terrible years of Thatcher, and Labour's failure to generally repeal most of the anti-trade union laws. I know there's been some repeals and some reforms.
Right.
The minimum wage was obviously a very important advance, but basically, you know, this latest pay freeze, below inflation, an effective pay cut for public service workers, plus appointing Digby Jones, you know, an anti-trade union man. I mean, it's like, how much more will the trade unions put up with? You know, they're quite clearly disrespected and devalued by both the Blair government and the Brown government.
Yes, the unions in the last government had an agreement, it's called the Warwick Agreement, very little of which has been implemented. The first line, the first battle with the unions, I think, is going to come as soon as party conference. And it's, forgive me, it's rather technical, but it boils down to the trade union's right to influence policy through votes at conference. And Gordon Brown has made it clear that he wants to abolish motions which can be voted on and therefore give the impression that the government and the party, and within it the unions, are always at war. His view is that they should be a system of discussing issues or topics without there being what he regards as a divisive and damaging vote. Now, the unions are not going to stand for that. There is a lot of discussion about how they should approach that without being seen to be too confrontational. This is their problem. If there is a row, they always get the blame. Their initial reaction to Blair, I've done it again, sorry, Gordon.
Well, it makes my point that Brown is a continuation of Blair by another name,
yes,
so far.
Indeed.
We live in hope for change, but, you know, carry on, sorry.
Although it is, I mean, in parenthesis, it is quite difficult to, not difficult, it's quite easy to forget that change has happened. I was talking to Chancellor Alistair Darling last night, but as he said, he sometimes hears announcements on the radio that the Chancellor's going to make a statement, and on this afternoon, as he joked, he said, I wonder what Gordon's done this time. But the unions started off thinking that Brown was inevitable. They would have liked somebody else, but they clearly it wasn't anybody else. And their strategy was to say, okay, this is somebody we've got to make listen and hear our case. Well, he's come out of the traps rather fast than they were anticipating, I think. And I think they're going to find it a lot more difficult and not quite as bad. I mean, Brown did attend the summer party of the Trade Union Congress the other day, which Blair never did in the 10 years of his government. And at that, people were saying, at least he talks our language. So there may be a more of a rapprochement, but what you end up with at the end of the day is always going to be what Gordon wants.
I mean, do you take the view that he is very much a control freak and that he doesn't really brook much criticism or alternative perspective, and once he's made up his mind, then he's pretty impervious to alternative perspectives?
I think that's his character, and I think that's how he's behaved in government up to now. He is making lots of noises about involvement and reaching out, and I mean, he says, for example, going back to the unions, that the reason he wants to speed these changes through is because he wants to get a new accord with the unions, and that has to be done by next April. And he wants them to be more involved in the process. So he's using language which is inclusive, because he's very aware that he's seen as too much of an isolated control freak. So I think he's recognised that it's a problem, and he's saying the right words to deal with it.
But is it going to be meaningful consultation? Because under the Blair years, we had the focus groups, and we had the big conversation, the tours around the country. But at the end of the day, the policies are still centrally decided in Downing Street, not even in the Labour Party conference.
That's clearly the worry. The overall effect of Brown's party reform proposals would be to take decisions away from party conference, even further than they were under the Blair years. So, and the quid pro quo is a strengthening of the National Policy Forum, which has already been shown not to work. It's neither democratic nor powerful, nor does it have control of party policy.
Yeah, to me, I mean, one of the reasons why I left Labour was, very reluctantly and painfully, was because, to me, the members don't really have any say over policy anymore. And,
no.
It's everything's centrally decided, and of course, the Prime Minister and his chief advisors and other cabinet ministers give a very important input. But when you have such clear, overwhelming grassroots party membership view in one direction and the government acts in the opposite, it isn't a democratic party.
That, after Iraq, is the main reason why the party membership has halved in the past 5 years.
How many members do you think the Labour Party's got now?
It's very difficult to say, but last figure I saw was about 180, 190,000. And that's very small, although official figures, it's claimed, show an increase of now of about 1,000 a week. So members are coming back. But in the hope now that they will have that say, because they think there's a change. If there isn't a change, and the reforms that Brown wants to push through do in fact retain that control at the top, and it's not spread among the members, then they'll just walk again.
I mean, just to shift back on to policy issues, I mean, one of the issues I raised in my introduction was Gordon Brown's reiterated a commitment to expanded nuclear power and really making it the central focus of his agenda for battling climate change. And I find it really strange that he doesn't seem to be at all open to the vast renewable resources we've got in this country, the best in Europe. They're not being exploited. We could be the world technology leader in wind, wave and tidal power. And in fact, research was done. British scientists pioneered these technologies in the 1970s. And, a Labour government ought to be developing these and could create tens of thousands of new jobs, permanent jobs, not just for our renewable energy industry, but for the rest of the world.
It is extraordinary. It does seem to have a completely closed mind on alternatives, and his decision on that was really preemptive of any government consultation.
So this is my point. You're talking about him consulting and so on.
Indeed.
But he's made the decision. Didn't say we're going to open this up to discussion. He said, he wants to press ahead with this programme.
Indeed, and he may find himself in legal trouble with that yet. Greenpeace are taking legal advice on whether he preempted the second go at a consultation, because he certainly, the courts found him not guilty, but found that the government's procedure was wrong in the first instance earlier in this year, and it looks like he may be in the same position again. He's rushed that one in a way that I don't think suits his own case, even if that is his view, and at the same time not giving much of a nod to any alternative whatsoever. I don't think I've heard Gordon Brown in the last 3 months say anything about the importance of alternatives, or any kind of calibrated statement on nuclear power. Okay, there is talk about this energy gap, which only nuclear power can fill, because we won't have the volume from alternatives on stream in time. But we don't hear him saying anything about it being scaled down, or what the scale of it would be. But it's talked of as a permanent energy source forever, the only one.
And he doesn't really address the issue of energy conservation, which could cut our energy needs by 30%.
No.
It'd be cheaper, faster, more efficient, and create tens of thousands of new skilled and semi-skilled jobs, which could boost the economy. It just seems madness.
I agree. As I say, I think he's got a very closed mind on it, but I'm not. I mean, the people that are around him who might be advising him on power are people like his brother Andrew, who works in the nuclear energy business for a French firm. So I agree with you. I think he's closed his mind. It needs to be opened under pressure, but I wouldn't be hopeful, frankly.
Just to wind up, I mean, let's assume you're right that he goes for an election next spring. What do you think are Labour's chances? I mean, do you think he's going to pull off the effect of change? Is he going to be able to tweak and, you know, ameliorate policies that will give a sense that change has happened, and will that be sufficient?
Well, I think that depends on on the basis where we are now. Certainly, yes, that he'd be back with a really, really comfortable majority. What may change between now and then is whether the public perceive the change to be genuine, how badly he handles whatever he may be planning to say about Iraq, or how well he handles it, and whether that's sufficient for a public that really wants to see our troops out of there as soon as possible. And it will depend on how Cameron bounces back, really. At the moment, it looks as though he's not going to.
Yeah. Well, as they often say, this is one to watch, and we'll see in the coming months.
Indeed.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining me for Talking with Tatchell. I hope you'll be with us again next week for another edition. Goodbye.